Welcome everyone. So today we are going to have another talk in our Rockefeller College election series covering major policy issues of the upcoming 2024 election. So we have three faculty members here. Each are going to talk about a very, very broad policy domain. So we are joined today first by Dr. Victor Asal. He's a professor here at Rockefeller College. He is the director of the Center for Policy Research and co-director of the project on violent conflict. We are also joined by Dr. Brian Greenhill. Dr. Greenhill is an associate professor and chair of the political science department. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Lucy Sorensen. She is an associate professor and a faculty fellow at the Nelson Rockefeller Institute of Government. So in a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Asal. He is going to talk about foreign policy, followed by Dr. Greenhill, who's going to discuss climate policy. And we're going to finish with Dr. Sorensen. She's going to talk about education policy. Before I hand it over to Dr. Asal, just the ground rules for today. If throughout any of the presentations you have questions you'd like to ask, as always, just put them in the chat and I'll read them to our panelists. Alternatively, as always, you can use the hand raise function and I can call on you if you'd like. So with that being said, I'll pass it over to Dr. Asal.
I started talking before I unmuted, so there we go. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the foreign policy positions of Trump and Harris. It's interesting that some of their foreign policy positions are not that different, and some of them are very different. It's also interesting, depending on what you mean by foreign policy can really vary. So that is something that's worth thinking about. So let me just go through. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to go through a bunch of topics quickly. When it comes to China, Harris thinks that U.S. needs to hold China responsible for human rights violations and its distortions to the global economy. But she wants to work with the country on various challenges that the world faces. Whereas Trump is much more aggressive in terms of seeing China as being involved in a lot of economic abuses, and he wants to protect American workers and reduce the large bilateral trade deficit the U.S. is facing with China. When it comes to NATO and defense, Harris is a very, very strong supporter of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. She is very strongly supportive of the U.S. commitment to Ukraine and really wants to make sure that the U.S. and NATO keep working together well and extending that effort. Trump thinks NATO is not great, and he has made several threats to withdraw from the alliance. And he has focused his defense spending when he was president on national security, and his focus has been, and he's not a fan of NATO, but he's focused on defense strategy related to China and Russia. When it comes to global health and pandemic prevention, Harris strongly feels that we need to prioritize national and international healthcare issues. And we need to make sure that we have strong pandemic prevention. She's also very strongly in favor of other health-related issues like abortion rights and other factors, and trying to help the opioid epidemic here in the U.S. and in other countries. When Trump was president, he had to deal with the actual COVID pandemic, and he authorized spending trillions of dollars to stimulate the the economy. Uh, but I should note he also and he supported money for private companies to develop vaccines, but he withdrew us from the World Health Organization, and he prevented organizations receiving U.S. funds for foreign aid related to abortion-related issues. So you can see already that when it comes to these issues, Trump and Harris really are in different worlds. When it comes to immigration and border security, Harris wants immigration reform, and she does want to protect the border, but she does feel that we need to do a better job in terms of how to deal with refugees. Whereas Trump sees stopping all illegal immigrants, period, and reducing legal immigration as much as possible also, and drastically increasing our deportation policy for everyone who comes in here that he thinks should not be around. When it comes to Israel, Gaza, and the Middle East, which is a big mess right now, as you all know, Hamas is very strongly supportive of a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, but also a hostage release agreement. She has been pushing for a two-state solution, whereas Trump's got a very strong support for Israel and Saudi Arabia, but he has backed away from having a separate Palestinian state. So whereas Harris is in favor of a two-state solution, Trump has really backed away from a two-state solution. Harris and Trump, when it comes to, I know I'm running out of time, Harris and Trump, when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, also have very different perspectives. Harris says she will help defend Ukraine as long as it takes and make sure that it is not, that it can protect itself from Russia, and wants to protect all of Europe from Russia's threats, and would like to authorize tremendous financial assistance to Ukraine. Whereas Trump says he's not going to commit to more aid to Ukraine if reelected, and he wants warmer relations with Russia and wants things to be much, much warmer with Putin than they currently are. And then finally, I mean, I've got a whole bunch of other stuff, but I will end right now. Harris is in favor of major trade deals that would include protection for workers and the climate, whereas Trump thinks that global trading systems is rigged against U.S. interests, and we need to stop worrying about all that stuff and rebalance trade towards our own self-interest. And did I go over? Am I good?
You're great. Yeah, we can pass it on to Dr. Greenhill now. Thank you so much, Dr. Asal.
Okay, so hi everyone, and thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this. So I'm going to talk about the contrast that currently exists between the two candidates in terms of climate policy. And in this respect, unlike some other policy dimensions, the contrast is just enormous between Harris and Trump. I mean, to not put too fine a point on it, we've got one candidate in Kamala Harris who's taking the problem seriously and is kind of thinking seriously about ways in which the US can address it both domestically kind of and at a global level. And then we've got another candidate in Donald Trump who is a climate denier. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. He describes climate change as a hoax. And he has already shown in 2017 and the first year of his presidency, his willingness to pull the US out of the 2015 Paris Agreement. But let's now kind of talk about just what the specifics are of their policy platforms. So Kamala Harris is wanting to build upon what I guess, certainly in the climate realm is the kind of signature achievement of the Biden presidency, which was the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act legislation, which although the name, is focused on inflation, it really was the US's kind of largest ever very serious climate policy that involved making huge investments in the energy transition and at the same time kind of coupling that with measures that you could argue were designed to kind of protect American manufacturing. So in that respect, in the kind of trade policy side of the approach to tackling climate change through the Inflation Reduction Act, you could see kind of echoes of Trump's kind of protectionist, kind of pro-US manufacturing trade policies. And that was something that certainly, caused a lot of upset for like our European allies who worried that this was, going to kind of lead to a trade war between the US and Europe, and not to mention China too, in terms of the creation of funding like new battery technologies and so on. So turning to as far as the Harris campaign is concerned, from what we can gather, although she's not, as far as I'm aware, kind of laid out like a very specific set of kind of climate policies, I think we can very much kind of expect a continuation of the Biden administration's, real desire to prioritize climate solutions. Trump, on the other hand, certainly doesn't want to have anything to do with climate change as an issue. Even quite recently, he used the term "drill, baby, drill" in one of his rallies, and he also was, he was recorded as saying, I think it was back in April, at a meeting with oil industry executives, that if they could raise $1 billion in contributions towards his campaign, he would pretty much ensure that he would kind of fight for whatever policies they favor. Now, of course, although neither Harris nor Trump have been very kind of specific in terms of climate policies, on the Republican side, what we can look at, of course, is the Project 2025 kind of blueprint for conservative policies across a whole range of issues. In terms of what this may suggest for Trump's climate agenda, although, of course, we should note that Trump has tried to distance himself from the Project 2025 blueprint. But basically what Project 2025 wants to do is, first of all, to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act and to greatly dismantle the ability of both the EPA and the Department of Energy to regulate and play a role at the federal level. So, for example, getting rid of things like energy efficiency standards on appliances. It also goes so far as to call for the, quote, unleashing all of America's energy resources, as well as getting rid of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and even privatizing the National Weather Service. So you can understand for a lot of climate activists, the platform that we can kind of assume is the Trump platform as embodied in Project 2025 is kind of a nightmare scenario for the climate. Stepping back though for a minute, I think one thing that's kind of interesting to reflect on just now is that climate change is not really a big issue in this election, right? There is a very good reason for arguing that climate change is like one of the major issues we kind of as a species should be kind of incredibly worried about right now, but it's actually playing a very small role in the 2024 election. And it's kind of interesting that there's some kind of interesting nuance to this because, on the one hand, I think Kamala Harris's campaign is kind of aware of the fact that the whole discussion of climate change is associated with kind of this kind of caricature of kind of far left politics that she wants to try to distance herself from in kind of tacking to the center. So it's interesting how, for example, on Kamala Harris's website, she boasts about the fact that the US has become a net oil exporter over the past 3 years, and the oil prices in the US are now at a 3-year low. So obviously that, that kind of cuts against the kind of energy transition message, but presumably strategically it's what she has been advised to do in order to not be seen as too kind of far left a candidate. Now, interestingly, on the Republican side, although talking about climate change under Trump's leadership of the party has kind of become a dirty word, it's interesting that many Republican candidates are still embracing certain kind of policies associated with the clean energy transition. They want to make sure that that the subsidies that have come in through the Inflation Reduction Act will still benefit their home states in terms of manufacturing plants. And they talk about doing things to kind of promote the energy transition and creating new manufacturing jobs, even though they don't like to use the actual terminology of climate change. So the last thing I want to say is, obviously, the outcome of this election will make a huge difference in terms of the role of US leadership in dealing with climate change, right? We saw in 2017, Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, which in effect didn't really lead to much change, but symbolically was like a kind of huge kind of slap in the face to the climate movement. No doubt we'll see more of that if Trump is successful in 2 weeks' time. On the other hand, I would caution my kind of climate interested colleagues not to be too kind of pessimistic about the outcome of a Trump presidency for the climate, because we do need to remember that even during Trump's presidency, from 2017 to 2020, there was still a lot of kind of very positive action being made at the state level, as we saw like here in New York State, for example. And there is still a lot of potential, and there's also a lot of kind of what you can think of as kind of baked in change with regard to the kind of clean energy transition that won't just overnight be undone by a Trump presidency. And whether Trump wins or Harris wins, either way, people who care about climate are going to have to continue to fight really, really hard to make sure that we take the kind of very, very aggressive actions that are needed in order to mitigate some of the kind of worst consequences of climate change.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Dr. Greenhill. So we'll turn it over now to our final speaker, Dr. Sorensen. She's going to talk about education policy.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be a part of this panel. So as Connor stated, my name is Lucy Sorensen, and my research expertise is in K-12 school systems and how they interact with broader patterns of social and economic inequality. I'll make a quick caveat, which is that I'm not going to talk about higher education or early childhood education, which are both very important topics and the candidates have very different positions on. So I really encourage you to look these up after the talk. But I think it's important when we're talking about presidential policy positions is to understand the role of federal government in K-12 education in general, because constitutionally speaking, public education is not a fundamental right. This was decided by a 1973 court case, San Antonio versus Rodriguez. It is a fundamental right in a lot of state constitutions. But what this means is that a lot of education, most education decision-making actually happens at the local and state levels, and the role of the federal government can be quite limited. So in terms of funding, for example, around 90% of school funding comes from either local property taxes or state revenues, and then around 10% from the federal government. I will note that this limited federal role in education has changed a little bit in recent years. So starting with the George W. Bush administration, he enacted the No Child Left Behind Act, which was a major change in US education policy, instituted high stakes test-based accountability across the US. This continued under the Obama administration with efforts such as Common Core, standard curriculum, Race to the Top grants. And so I think it's important to keep in mind this limited but growing role of the federal government in education in mind as we talk about Vice President Harris and former President Trump and what their positions are in the education space. So in short, neither candidate really has much in the way of what I would consider substantive policy proposals in this space. I'll start with Donald Trump, because they do have notable differences in kind of their priorities related to education that I think we can still talk about. So Donald Trump has famously announced that he would eliminate the Department of Education. I think it's important to note that I don't think this is actually possible, and most people don't think this is possible. Only Congress can eliminate the department, and both Republicans and Democrats in Congress have not expressed any real interest in eliminating the Department of Education. And secondly, the Department of Education has two really important funding streams. One is for the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. So this funds a lot of programs for students with disabilities across the country. And the second is the Title I program, which provides monetary supplements to schools that serve a high proportion of students in poverty. And so I think it's very unlikely that Donald Trump would end either of these funding streams, although he certainly could try to chip away at them, kind of decrease their budgets, things like that. Trump's second main policy position is he's very pro school choice. So as president, he chose Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. She's a very strong advocate for voucher systems. And the way that vouchers work is instead of providing taxpayer money to public schools, it provides a voucher to parents that they can use to pay at private schools to send their child to a private school. And this is controversial. This is a controversial program because in essence, what it does is, again, it takes money away from public schools and sends taxpayer money to schools that are allowed to teach religious-centered education and or to discriminate against certain groups of students, notably LGBT students, English learners, students with disabilities. And Trump's final policy position is that he wants to use the Department of Education, which he formally said he wanted to get rid of, but he also wants to use the staff there to go after legally schools that teach about topics such as systemic racism, gender and sexuality, or that allow trans students to participate in sports. So he wants to actually increase the presence of the federal government in monitoring curriculum and instruction in ways that's quite new. Okay, moving to Kamala Harris. Sorry, I haven't been keeping track of time very well. So she has not made K-12 education a central part of her policy agenda, but she has spoken out against each of these proposals from Trump. And we can glean things from programs that she has supported in the past. So for instance, she has supported, and I believe would continue to support, efforts to increase funding through the Title I program, which again goes to schools in low-income communities. She's also expressed that she would use the Civil Rights Office in the Department of Education to protect vulnerable students instead of kind of combating schools and teachers that teach about controversial topics. And finally, it's worth noting that she's very motivated by her personal background, where in Berkeley, she was part of a desegregation program, a busing program. And this came up in some of the early Democratic presidential candidate debates. And she has, again, in the past, supported efforts to continue racial desegregation of public schools in modest ways. So in sum, if I had to kind of encapsulate the Donald Trump strategy to education, it would be to decrease the government role in education in favor of privatization and combat woke ideology in schools. And if I had to encapsulate the Kamala Harris strategy, it would be to increase the government protection of vulnerable students and promote equity and educational opportunity. All right, thanks. I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Sorensen, and thanks again to all of our panelists. So we're going to now turn to the Q&A phase of today's talk. So if anyone has any questions, just put them in the chat. I'll also monitor to see if anyone raises their hand. It doesn't look like we have any questions at the moment, although some might pop up. I want to start off. I have a question for Dr. Asal about tariffs and the seemingly changing international system. So in the era of Trump, I think it's fair to say tariffs have risen high on the public agenda. Harris has criticized Trump repeatedly for his tariff policy, referring to it as the Trump tax. But it looks like the Biden administration has not only kept a lot of tariffs in place, but I think in the spring imposed some new tariffs on China and the electronics industry, like semiconductors and stuff like that. Should we be reading anything into the United States as increasing kind of turn inward in terms of political economy? Does that say anything about the international state system at the moment?
I'm not sure. International trade is not my main focus. But I will say that when it comes to tariffs, Harris seems to be somebody who doesn't think we should be posing tariffs on a lot of things, whereas Trump thinks we need to really reorder the entire international global trading system to benefit the United States because he thinks it's rigged against us. And I saw that Professor Greenhill had something he wanted to say, I believe.
Oh, no, I was just going to chime in and say that, we've definitely seen a convergence among both parties in terms of their kind of skepticism of trade more generally. If we think back to say the 2016 election, when right at that point, Hillary Clinton, as you may remember, in the last few months, walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was this Obama initiative to try to, create this big new free trade agreement in the Pacific. And, once she basically saw which way kind of public sentiment was moving against free trade, she adopted that position. And now, what we've seen also in the Biden administration, are very much a kind of unwillingness to roll back the tariffs that Trump had put in place, even though the Democrats nowadays don't use the same kind of protectionist language that Trump has brought into the kind of mainstream Republican Party nowadays, or what we now call the mainstream Republican Party. To me, the striking thing is really the convergence rather than the divergence between the two candidates in terms of trade policy, even though rhetorically it's very different. And I should say too that the kind of general spirit of international cooperation, I think, is still very strong on the Democratic side, in a way that it's not on the Republican side, at least for now.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Asal and Dr. Greenhill. It looks like we have a question in the chat from Dr. Novkov, and this one's directed at Dr. Greenhill. So she writes, given the growing number of billion-dollar natural disasters that appear to be related to climate change, why do you think it's not really coming up as an issue, this campaign? She writes that she just checked some data, and even among young voters who you think could be getting traction with, it's just not.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think climate change is often cited, in people's kind of like top 5 or top 10 list of issues they care about, but it's almost never number one. And, You know, I mean, even just yesterday, for example, I was at Price Chopper doing grocery shopping and was kind of, you know, somewhat horrified by the prices of some of the sort of basic things I was going to be putting into my shopping cart. And I was thinking, you know, oh my God, this, you know, of course, this is why people, you know, don't take climate change seriously, right? It's so much more kind of um salient an issue for you, you know, just when you're filling up your shopping cart than thinking about, you know, the what each of the candidates might do or not do with regard to dealing with climate change. And unfortunately, you know, I think even though there's obviously been a huge change in the past, you know, 10 or 20 years in terms of just the salience of climate change as an issue, where you know it's just something that most people nowadays, thankfully, you know, believe is a real thing, but it just keeps falling behind all the other more pressing kind of day-to-day concerns that people have. It doesn't evoke that kind of immediate fear that things like, you know, terrorism or, you know, in a more mundane way, even just higher prices do for ordinary people.
All right, it looks like we have two questions in the chat here. So the first is from Renee here. So she writes that Professor Greenhill mentioned that climate policies can seem too left, and Professor Sorensen noted that some education policies could seem woke. So the question is, some people may see these words as a badge of honor, but some of them think of them as negative. How do you think these types of labels affect the ability to get common sense slash progressive policies enacted?
You can start, Brian.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think in this election, unfortunately, it's you know that both candidates are feeling this pressure to kind of tack towards the center, kind of as you would expect. But I guess for reasons I can't quite explain, you know, climate change in the US political discourse has become this kind of dirty word, which is a shame because, you know, in most other democracies, parties on both the right and the left are able to have a kind of constructive debate about policies for dealing with climate change, just as, you know, people differ on almost any other kind of political issue, whether that be, you know, dealing with Russia, dealing with China or whatever. But for some reason, just mentioning climate change is this kind of triggering word because of the way in which it's kind of been demagogued by people like Donald Trump. And so I think it's very unfortunate that we've ended up in that place here in the US, but you know, here we are, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think in the education space, it's been much the same way in that education, in my view, is actually a very important issue in this election. And yet I told you that neither candidate really has much in the way of policy positions. And it's an important issue because coming out of the pandemic, I mean, for a few reasons, coming out of the pandemic, the parents' rights movement really took off in that parents have an increased sense of that they should be able to choose what gets taught and what doesn't get taught in public schools. Book bans have been on the rise, etc. As school board meetings have become much more contentious, and so there's this highly political charge in public education in the way that I think there wasn't really before the pandemic. And then the second point is that, and this one is also sad to me, is that I think that in particular, the Republican Party has really jumped on this issue of trans youth and are using people's kind of fear and misunderstanding around transgender youth to kind of build a narrative that what liberals want is for schools to, you know, teach everyone how to transition to the opposite gender and blah, blah, blah. And so I don't see these as serious, you know, I think they are important policy issues, but it's honestly a bit of a distraction. And Kamala Harris has not really spoken out very much on the issue of this type of thing, like policies related to trans students in schools. in part because I think it's such a hot button topic and people have such strong stereotypes and negative reactions around that issue. So yeah, I think that, to your point, Renee, this label effect definitely has come into play and politicized some of these issues that didn't used to be quite so political.
Our next question in the chat is from Joel Harmon. So he writes, there seems to be quite a strong movement toward inward nationalism and protectionism, this country and many others. How is this affecting the election issues, generally speaking? And why don't more people get, he writes, that tariffs are taxes that always hurt consumers?
Yeah, if I may jump in here, I think it's a really good question. I mean, when if you take a step back and just think, here we have a Republican candidate who is running on a platform of wanting to put on this like 20% across the board tariff, and in some cases, even much higher. Why isn't that absolutely devastating to his campaign? And why aren't other Republicans, the sort of what used to be the establishment Republicans, speaking out against this? And I think it's, a really kind of fascinating indicator of how the kind of base of the Republican Party has moved over the past 10 years or so. But I think it also speaks to the fact that, frankly, tariffs are a really boring issue. Most people don't have a clue what tariffs are. And certainly most even very well-educated people would struggle to refute the claim that Donald Trump frequently makes about how tariffs are something that is going to be paid for by the exporting country rather than the consumers in the importing country. That, that part of the kind of logic is difficult for people to understand. And, I thought it was striking during the presidential debate when Kamala Harris, if I remember correctly, like one of her first answers was to talk about, she tried to frame the tariffs thing as like the Trump sales tax. And I thought, wow, maybe that will kind of, become a thing that people really are talking about in this election. But my understanding, at least, has been it's just not really gained traction. And I'd be curious to know if the other panelists have ideas as to why that's not resonating, but for some reason it's just not.
I think it's not resonating because I think most people don't care because it doesn't affect them or they don't think it affects them. So they're just not paying attention to it.
We talk about, I teach economics and we talk about tariffs a lot. And yeah, it's just so easy for people who institute a tariff to say, this is a tariff against goods imported from China. And in doing so, it makes it sound like this is a punishment for China, when really, obviously, it's a punishment for us as well. And so it is, we need more econ classes. I don't know. It is one of those sad issues where I think both the Democrats and the Republicans have definitely moved in more protectionist directions. And in my mind, it's possibly because of just this misunderstanding.
All right, so we have our next question is from Dr. Novkov again. So it's for Professor Asal. She asks, is there any possibility of serious movement toward de-escalation in the Middle East prior to the election? Or does Biden really just have no leverage at all in the situation?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. I don't think Netanyahu has an interest in de-escalation, and Hamas certainly doesn't. I think a large portion of Israelis would like a new prime minister, but that has not been successful. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been protesting Netanyahu now for a long time. But until Israel has a new prime minister, and until Hamas no longer has the kind of control that they have, unless there's a president who becomes very forceful, I don't see things moving in a good direction anytime soon, unfortunately.
All right, well, continuing our trend of policy issues that are not getting addressed, and I think Dr. Greenhill has probably already somewhat answered my question here, but are there any significant policy areas that no matter which candidate wins in this election, just aren't going to get addressed at all? There's just no electoral incentive to really do anything about in each of your domains. Whoever wants to go first, too, please.
Repeat that question again.
Yeah, sure. Are there any major policy issues in your domain of expertise that neither candidate looks like they're really going to address, where there doesn't seem to be an electoral incentive for any sort of solution?
I guess I can take first stab, which is that I had mentioned that Kamala Harris, came out as promoting school desegregation efforts, and that, she even supported a bill that was passed that does support school districts in, doing voluntary integration efforts. I think that this is something that just based on how difficult various court cases have made it to make serious progress in, if we think of desegregation as a goal that we want in education, that we want more integration racially, socioeconomically, et cetera. If you think that's a goal that we want, I think that's very unlikely, because there are just it's legally very difficult to force school districts and states to do it, and without forcing anyone to do it, it's unlikely it's going to happen. So that was the one thing I mentioned that I think there's unlikely to be any serious movement on, even though it's something that Kamala Harris appears to be passionate about.
I think another thing I would throw out there, which may seem more of a kind of esoteric point, but the idea of kind of serious reform to our kind of voting systems, thinking about how we might reform the role of the Electoral College, thinking about getting away from first past the post voting systems or moving to kind of ranked choice systems and things like that is something that I think would be very popular with most of the electorate if it was explained in a way that was kind of understandable. But it's very hard to imagine either of the two major parties at the moment wanting to kind of take on that challenge.
Yeah, I was actually going to say the same thing. I think the United States would tremendously benefit from a popular vote for the United States president, where the person who gets the most votes wins the election, which on more than one occasion, we've had a president who did not get the most votes who won the election. And I would very strongly like, even if I don't like the candidate who wins, I would very strongly like to have a country where the candidate gets the most vote wins. But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But it should.
All right, it appears we have two comments or two questions in the chat. So we have another from Dr. Novkov. She writes that I know it's not anyone's central area, but do any of you see any possibility of comprehensive reform of immigration law, depending on the combination of who wins the presidency and both the House and the Senate? She continues, many Americans seem to be in favor of the traditional bargain of increasing border security, but allowing more people who are here to gain legal status at the same time. So what do each of you think about immigration reform, if anything?
I think that is very unlikely. I think that currently we have serious disagreements in both parties related to this issue. I do not think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't see any hope for this just now, which is, I mean, it's heartbreaking, but I don't see a path for the time being.
Now, that's why we should elect Lucy Sorensen as president, because she will do a great job on most of these issues. So,
Thank you for your vote, Victor.
All right, our next question is from Renee. She writes, obviously, there have always been differences in opinion on policy issues, but one of the most striking things to me that has occurred over the last several years is the failure to acknowledge that facts do exist. With climate change, for instance, why do you think some candidates / parties ignore the science? Is there anything we can do to change this going forward? Finally, why don't facts matter anymore?
We have a huge swath. Oh, go ahead, Brian. It looks like you were.
No, you go ahead first. It's fine.
We have a huge swath of Americans who are about their opinion and not about facts. And there are a large amount of politicians and a large amount of Americans who refuse to accept the fact that global warming is a serious issue. And it doesn't matter what the science is, they're not going to hear it. And that's not just climate change. There are lots of issues where people embrace what they think without looking at the facts. And we would be in a much better place if people would actually look at the facts and understand the situation. When it comes to, I mean, I've talked to people who tell me that climate change is not real. And I say to them, yes, it is. Why you say, no, it's not. I've read enough to know that it's not real. And unfortunately, there are way too many Americans who buy that. And there are unfortunately too many politicians who exploit that for their own benefit.
I think, yeah, I would just add that, two factors that kind of play an important role in this are, first of all, the kind of populist turn in the past 10 years or so, where people are just generally, the public is just generally more kind of cynical about political elites, and elites of all types, including us academics. And while maybe some skepticism is healthy in certain contexts, it's now been kind of applied to basically any form of expertise. And obviously we saw that happen in such a devastating way during the COVID crisis, where there was just this kind of flagrant disregard for kind of scientific expertise on many of these questions. So I think that's one big factor that's just a general kind of structural factor. Another one too is the kind of information environment that we're operating in. The fact that obviously most people are getting their news nowadays from social media. We're not all tuning in to watch, whatever NBC nightly news or whatever people used to sort of sit around the TV watching and sort of trusting in the authority of these. So it's just all too easy now for these kind of quote unquote alternative facts to dominate. And so when it comes to something like climate change, I mean, we saw even in the vice presidential debate, the way that J.D. Vance answered that question about climate change, where he kind of started by saying like, well, even if you accept the premise that climate change is real, and then he went on to give some answer where, but just kind of trying to even kind of question the idea that something that enjoys just such an overwhelming scientific consensus is still just kind of a matter of opinion is, not only harmful from a kind of climate change point of view, but also it just kind of corrodes this idea of kind of respect for kind of scientific knowledge, which is so damaging. And obviously we as educators, we want to teach our students to be critical thinkers and to challenge expertise where appropriate, but we don't want them just to burn the whole thing down and say that nothing can ever be believed anymore. So I'm not sure how this will turn out, but I think we're certainly at a point in our history where there's a real kind of crisis of confidence in the knowledge we generate.
I think they put it really well, so I don't have anything to add.
All right. So it looks like we have time for 2 questions here. So I have, I think it's a message from Dennis. Dennis, and this is really, I think, most suitable for Dr. Asal. Dennis writes, I haven't heard the candidates speaking about issues regarding either China or North Korea. Where do the candidates stand on U.S. foreign policy towards these 2 nations? I think you're muted, Dr. Asal.
Okay. North Korea, they really haven't talked much about. I don't think it's going to make I don't think the policies that we currently have towards North Korea are going to be changing anytime soon. Right? I mean, I just don't. And you know, when it comes to China, as I think I mentioned before, Harris really thinks the US has got to hold China responsible for its human rights violations and how it's distorting the global economy. But she also thinks that we need to work with China to make things better as well. Whereas Trump is really wants to have aggressive policies to protect the U.S. Economy from China. He wants to put new laws into place, and he wants to work to reduce the U.S. bilateral trade deficit against, that we have with China. And he wants to confront China over economic abuses. Now, something that we haven't really mentioned is Taiwan, okay? And when it comes to Taiwan, Harris has said, we're going to continue to support Taiwan and for self-defense. And she's met with Taiwan's president in the past and will continue to support. Trump has not really said a lot about Taiwan, but has said there's no chance that China is going to invade Taiwan, so it's really not a serious issue.
Our next question, this is a fun one here from Toby Greenfield. He writes, not to sound dire, but is there any reason, anything at all, to be optimistic about this election?
Well, who wrote this?
His name is Toby Greenfield.
Well, totally, it depends upon who you want to have win. I think that there is a large portion of the American population who are keeping their fingers crossed that one person wins. And there's another large portion of the American population that is keeping their fingers crossed that the other person wins. And my one concern is, after the last election, we had some unpleasantness, and that unpleasantness, I'm assuming everybody knows what the heck I'm talking about, yes? That was completely wrong and very dangerous to American democracy. Okay, what was done after that election was very dangerous, and if Harris wins, I am nervous that something like that could very possibly happen again, and that could be extremely problematic.
I would just add on the optimism side, and obviously without knowing anything about the questioner's own politics. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is there's really so little we know based on, although there's obviously a huge polling industry, and the consensus in the past few weeks has been that this is very much a tied race. But even though, millions of dollars has been spent administering these surveys, we still have to keep in mind that these models depend entirely on very kind of ultimately unscientific projections of actual turnout on each side. So the polling industry has been burned twice, in 2016 and again in 2020, by the extent to which they underestimated the willingness of, the so-called low propensity voters to come out in support of Trump. It is possible that they've now overcorrected, and it's certainly feasible that we will find that maybe this was a much tighter, or that Kamala Harris has a much larger advantage than it seems, but maybe not. It's incredibly difficult to make any predictions about that. So I think the most we can say right now is, by all accounts, it's a tied race. I think there are lots of kind of structural features that, whether you like it or not, favor Trump in this current environment. But obviously, as a candidate, he has, enormous baggage. But the final thing I would say, just in terms of the kind of optimism side, is that, their American democracy, I think, is still fairly robust, at least when you look on a kind of cross-national perspective. We do still have certain kind of checks and balances in place here that some other, especially newer democracies, tend not to have quite as strongly. So I think that this does kind of constrain the ability of a president to make real kind of radical change in a way that maybe we wouldn't see in other democracies. But that's not, of course, to minimize the very serious consequences that the outcome of this election is likely to have, for the world, quite frankly.
Well, Lucy, do you want to add something? So something I have to note, which is depressing, is there are way too many Americans today who still have a sexist or racist perspective. And I really wish that would go away in general, but it's still there. And I'm sure that most people here are aware of what I'm talking about. Yes. And B, it could have an impact on the election results.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we have time probably to squeeze in one final question here. So I'm sorry we have one from Joel Harmon. I don't think we'll have time to get to. My apologies. The question here kind of expands on a question we had earlier. It's from David Davies. He writes, to what extent is the media culpable for a world in which facts are not accepted? For instance, an agreement not to do checking during the vice presidential debate.
Happy to start, even though this isn't something I think about a ton, which is just that, and this is to build on Dr. Greenhill's point earlier, which is that just how much the information ecosystem has changed. And I think the availability of alternatives has pressured the kind of mainstream media to be possibly less responsible and to do things that, could harm the situation rather than help it. But the fact is, if some media source is keeping people accountable in a particular way, well, there are alternatives out there. I can go on social media. I can go to all of these alternative sources of information. And so I think it's the fact that there's not that, because there are so many alternative options out there, there's no real incentive for media to take this really responsibly, because if people read something they don't like or see something they don't like, they're going to just switch the channel. So that's my kind of take on this, is that yes, probably they are culpable, but also they're being influenced by an ecosystem that is not supportive of really rigorous, objective news anymore.
All right, well, it looks like we're basically out of time here. Thank you so much again to the panelists and to everybody who participated in today's event. You can catch the Rockefeller College election series on Wednesday, so same exact time, 12 to 1 on Zoom. We're going to be joined by Dr. Weiss and Dr. Ingram, and they're going to talk about civil disobedience. So that'll be a fun time. Thank you again, everyone, and see you on Wednesday.